13 tanks. That's what's left of the regiment. The fuel gauge reads a quarter. The radio is static and screaming. And across that ridge, visible now in the morning haze, 160 Panzers are forming into line. Your squadron started yesterday with 18 Crusaders. You can see 5 still moving. Somewhere to your left, the other 2 squadrons have 8 between them. You know this because the radio net has gone quiet. One by one, the call signs stopped answering. You are 19 years old. Most of the men in these turrets are. Some are younger. None of them expected to grow old in the desert, but none of them expected to die before lunch either. The turret ahead of you is open. Black smoke pouring out. Nobody's climbing out. Nobody's going to. The order comes through anyway. Crackle and hiss. Then a voice, all dog units. Advance, engage at range. Engage at range. The 88s have been killing you at 2,000 meters all week. Over a mile out. Your 2-pounder can't touch them until 500 meters. About 550 yards. Would you climb back into that turret, knowing the last crew is still burning 30 yards ahead? About 27 meters? Because the order said advance again? They did. A full regiment ground down to 13 against 160 Panzers for 4 days. Rommel would call it the most brutal fighting he'd seen in Africa. He wasn't exaggerating. He was there, watching his tactics work, watching British armor burn in clusters, watching the charges come anyway. This is the story the desert tried to bury. Not a victory, not a clean defeat. Something messier. A slaughter that taught the survivors everything they needed to know. Everything they'd use 1 year later at a place called Snipe to finally break him. But first, they had to survive this. November 1941, the Libyan desert. The British were about to attempt something they'd never done, destroy Rommel in open battle, Operation Crusader, the largest armored offensive the British Empire had ever launched in Africa. 3 armored brigades, over 700 tanks rolling west toward Tobruk, which had been besieged for 7 months. The plan was elegant on paper. Sweep south around Rommel's flank. Concentrate at a place called Sidi Rezegh, a dusty airfield 20 kilometers, 12 miles southeast of Tobruk. Draw the Afrika Korps into a decisive engagement. Crush them with superior numbers. The numbers looked good. The 700 British tanks against Rommel's 260. Nearly 3 to 1. Here's what the numbers didn't show. The British 2-pounder gun, standard armament on the Crusader tank, could penetrate German armor at 500 meters, 547 yards. Maybe, if the angle was right. The German 88mm Flak, 36, 3.5 inches of pure killing power, could kill a Crusader at 2,000 meters, 2,187 yards. No maybe, no angle required. 2,000 versus 500. 4 to 1 in range. And Rommel had figured out how to use that gap. Fix the enemy with the 88s. Let them charge into the kill zone. Flank with Panzers once they're committed. The British hadn't figured out the counter yet. They were still fighting like cavalry, massed charges. Close the distance, trust in numbers. Against the 88, numbers just meant more burning tanks. While the 7th Armored Division led the advance. The Desert Rats, the most famous tank formation in the British Army. 3 brigades. The 7th Armored Brigade alone fielded 129 tanks on November 19th, 1941. By the morning of 22nd November, they'd been in continuous contact for 3 days. They'd taken the airfield, lost it, retaken it, lost it again. They were down to 70 tanks, and the Germans were concentrating. If you've watched our episode on the stand at Snipe, you know what the 7th Armored would eventually become. The gunners who destroyed 52 Panzers in a single day with 19 anti-tank guns. But that was October 1942. Those were survivors, hardened, educated. This is where the education began. And the tuition was paid in blood. 22nd of November, 0615 hours. Dawn over Sidi Rezegh. Now, the reconnaissance reports started coming in before breakfast. Dust clouds from the east, from the south, from the northwest. 3 columns converging. Able 6, this is Dog 3. Confirming armor concentration bearing 135. I count 60, possibly 70 vehicles. Panzers and armored cars mixed. Range approximately 6,000 yards, about 5.5 kilometers, and closing. Over. That was just one column. The 21st Panzer Division from the east, the 15th Panzer from the south, Italian armor filling the gaps, 160 tanks total, maybe more, and the 7th Armored Brigade, what remained of it, had 70. Brigadier Jock Campbell, commanding the 7th Support Group, saw what was coming. Infantry and artillery positions about to be overrun by armor. No time to withdraw, no reinforcements within range. He spent that day standing upright in an open staff car, no armor, no cover, driving between gun positions under direct fire, directing 25-pounders onto tank targets with hand signals because the radios had failed. His driver was killed. He found another, kept going. The citation for his Victoria Cross would call it inspiring leadership in the face of overwhelming odds. The men who watched him called it something else. They expected him to die any minute. He didn't. Not that day. He died 3 months later. Car accident. The desert took him anyway. The tank engagements on 22nd November weren't battles. They were collisions. British squadrons advancing into prepared positions. German 80s opening up at range. Crusaders brewing up before their gunners could identify what was killing them. The war diary of the 7th Armored Brigade. What fragments survived records the timeline in losses. 0730 hours. Contact with enemy armor. 2 tanks lost. 0815 hours. Squadron engaged by anti-tank guns, bearing unknown. 6 tanks lost. 0847 hours. Attempting to outflank enemy position. Enemy position was false. Actual guns 400 meters east, about 440 yards. 4 tanks lost. 0923 hours. Ammunition resupply failed to arrive. 3 tanks immobilized awaiting rounds. Let that sit for a moment. By 0930 hours, 3 hours after breakfast, they'd lost 15 tanks and hadn't landed a decisive blow. The afternoon was worse. Rommel committed his reserve. Both Panzer divisions drove directly into the airfield complex. The 7th Support Group's infantry positions were overrun. Anti-tank guns fought until the crews were killed beside them. By sunset, the 7th Armored Brigade had fewer than 50 tanks operational. The perimeter had shrunk to less than 2 kilometers across, barely over a mile, and Rommel wasn't finished. November 23rd. Totensonntag. The Germans named it that. Sunday of the Dead. They weren't being dramatic. The South African 5th Infantry Brigade had moved up overnight to reinforce the airfield. Infantry, trucks, a few anti-tank guns. They were supposed to provide depth to the defense. At 0630 hours, a massive dust cloud appeared on the horizon to the southeast. The South Africans cheered. They stood up in their slit trenches. They waved. They thought it was the 1st Army Tank Brigade arriving to relieve them. After 3 days of hell, the reinforcements had finally come. It wasn't the British. It was the entire Afrika Korps. 150 Panzers, rolling in a solid phalanx. Dust billowing 500 feet into the air, over 150 meters. The realization hit too late. The division's war diary, what survived of it, records the time contact was lost with Baker Company at 0847 hours, Charlie Company at 0912 hours. By 1100 hours, the brigade had effectively ceased to exist. 1 regiment, 224 killed, 379 captured. 3 hours. That number is real. Read it again. The graves registration teams worked for a week afterward. They found bodies clustered around gun positions that had been overrun. They found vehicles still burning 4 days later. They found ammunition still boxed, units destroyed before they could fire a shot. The remnants of the 7th Armored Brigade, 30 tanks now, maybe fewer, counterattacked into that chaos, into 150 Panzers that had just finished destroying an infantry brigade. Crusaders at 30 miles per hour across open ground. Into the 80s, into the waiting guns. More burning tanks. By nightfall on the 23rd of November, the 7th Armored Brigade had 10 runners. 10. From 129 4 days earlier. Rommel signaled Berlin that evening. The British armor, he reported, had been destroyed. The offensive had failed. Most of their names aren't in any book you'll find. Crews who charged, knowing the mathematics, knowing the range gap, knowing the last squadron didn't make it either. A like helps these stories reach people who should hear them. If this is the kind of history that matters to you, subscribe. The survivors walked out carrying wounded, salvaging what they could from wrecks. And here's where the story turns. Lieutenant General Cunningham, commanding the 8th Army, wanted to retreat. He'd seen the figures. His armored force was gone, the offensive had failed. But Auchinleck flew up from Cairo and overruled him. No retreat. Continue the attack. It was insane. Or it was genius. Rommel had won every engagement. His tactics were perfect. His armor was intact, but his logistics were broken. The Afrika Korps had burned through ammunition at Sidi Rezegh faster than Tripoli could replace it. Rommel's dash to the Egyptian border meant to shatter British morale, consume fuel that didn't exist in the supply chain. And the British, despite everything, still had reserves coming up from Egypt. Rommel had won the battle, but he'd used up everything doing it. Operation Crusader continued. Tobruk was relieved. The Afrika Korps retreated west, and the 7th Armored Division was pulled back, given replacement tanks, given replacement crews, and sent back into the line. The lessons weren't in any manual. The 88 couldn't be charged. It had to be flanked, or outranged with better guns. But by October 1942, the survivors knew things that couldn't be taught. They'd learned them at Sidi Rezegh, paid for them and their friends. The generation that fought this is almost gone. If you carry their stories, share one below. The comments section is an archive, too. Rommel called Sidi Rezegh the most brutal fighting I've seen in Africa. He meant it as professional respect. His tactics had worked. His men had won. But the men who survived heard something different. They heard, "We charged. It didn't work. Next time, we make them come to us." The wind still blows across Sidi Rezegh. The airfield is gone. The wrecks have been salvaged for scrap. There's nothing left to mark where the 7th Armored Brigade was destroyed and reborn in the same week. But the lessons are still there, written in the sand, carried in the survivors. The survivors didn't talk about Sidi Rezegh. But 16 months later, at a shallow depression in the desert called Outpost Snipe, some of them were waiting again, 19 guns, 52 Panzers, and this time, they showed Rommel what it felt like, to be the one burning